Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Good Citizens of Robotics Research workshop, where we will be having discussions on various topics about our community, its culture, and how we conduct research. I'm Mustafa Mukadam, a researcher at Facebook AI, and today I'm joined by my co-organizer, Nima. Nima, if you would like to introduce yourself quickly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nima Fazeli. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and I work on robotic manipulation.
We also want to mention our co-organizer, Nico Sundarov, who will be joining us for the sessions later. First, I want to thank all our invited speakers for their awesome and insightful talks. If you have not seen them already, I would highly encourage you to go check them out on our website later. So let's get started with our first panel session. We will go around the room, and it would be nice if you all can introduce yourself and then maybe give a quick 1 or 2 minute short summary about your talks. And then we'll go ahead and get started with the questions. So, Wolfram, why don't you get started?
Okay, yes. Hello, good afternoon, or whatever time it is in the place you live. I'm Wolfram. I'm VP for Automated Driving Technology at the Toyota Research Institute, and at the same time, Professor for Computer Science at the University of Freiburg on leave right now. I'm working on mobile robotics, machine learning for robots, and all kinds of other interesting areas these days. I gave a presentation about how to give a presentation, hoping that my presentation actually follows the way I want presentations to be given. It's a short version of a longer presentation that I usually give, and in which I collect the things that I don't like, but actually turned them into like positive recommendations. I think at RSS, we typically have really great talks, polished 3-minute or 5-minute talks. But at other conferences, like in these 10-minute talks, there's plenty of mistakes people can do. And just to optimize them, I actually put all the things together that I realized in my life. And I hope you're enjoying it and have different opinions, of course.
Stephanie.
Hey, I'm Stephanie Telix. I'm a professor at Brown University, and my research is robots and language. And my talk was about best practices for making robot videos. And this was in collaboration with my PhD student, Eric Rosen. So this was motivated really by Eric's, the whole paper was Eric's idea, and we had it like in, I apologize about the screaming. I'm home with my son. The whole paper was really Eric's idea. And what we tried to do was write down some maxims that, I think most people in the community are following, but really had never been written or codified for, what are best practices when making a video to show your robot doing stuff. And we're really interested in collecting feedback about them. And we gave a bunch of examples. All of the good examples were other people's videos, and all of the bad examples were our videos. So we're not out to like pillory anybody, but we just wanted to have a conversation as a community about what it means to make a good video and what are the best practices when you're doing that.
And finally, Alberto.
Hello, my name is Alberto Rodriguez. I'm from Mechanical Engineering Department at MIT, and I work in robotic manipulation. And truth be told, the talk that I gave for this workshop, which is on good practices for good writing, wasn't the talk that I intended to give at the beginning, but I was inspired by being on the same panel with Wolfram and Stephanie, who talked about giving talks and giving videos. So I thought, maybe we should sort of complete the circle and talk a little bit about writing papers. It's basically a few thoughts and good practices that I've been collecting over the years, mostly sort of inspired by other people's thoughts and best practices that I just found useful for myself. And I just wanted to share it, a distilled version of those practices.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's a really good segue actually into maybe the first question that we can get us started with. So you mentioned the circle, completing the circle. So uh, in many ways, writing papers and giving a presentation is a two-way street. And especially with videos today that often serve as a stand-in for spotlight talks. So if you all can talk about the interplay between the three and what is the efficient way to navigate all the three together, especially when you're working on deadlines, and then how can information flow between the three so that you can optimize all of them together at once. So please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me go ahead. I do not want to hijack this. I will just step back
No,
afterwards.
please go ahead.
So I think currently, because of all these deadlines, or usually because of the deadlines, we actually do not have time for thinking this entirely through and really realize that circle in full extent. I think it is right now, evolution-wise, it's a sequential process. First the paper, then videos, if there's a video deadline after the paper deadline, and then the presentation at the very end. If it's a presentation video, then they come together. But if it is like for ICRA conferences where you do have like 1 week, one more week for creating your video, that is also something where it is actually separated. And I think that sometimes people realize this when finally preparing the presentation, that the paper should have been slightly different, but in order to make things more clear. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. So, I mean, they're clearly related, right? So videos, papers, talks, they're all are aiming at transferring information and implanting your ideas into someone else's brain, and try to keep them there for as long as possible. But there's, I think that there's some key differences in the way that the receiver is sort of experiencing that transfer of information, right? So at the end, the way I see it is that writing or giving a talk or preparing a video is an exercise of empathy with whoever is receiving the information, right? With the reader, for example, and try to visualize what of the things that you're doing or you're saying or you're writing will become distractions, so that the person that is receiving the information can focus on the message. And the source of distractions are quite different when you're preparing a video or writing a paper or giving a talk, right? So when you're writing a paper, the reader has full ownership of the timing and can stop and reread, but it's something that cannot do when it's listening to a talk. So when you're writing a paper, the source of distractions are extraneous ideas that you're implanting unintentionally, or extra words or complicated sentences. When you're giving a talk, there's many more possible sources of distraction, right? So you are talking at the same time we have slides, and you have to sort of understand where the listening is going to be looking at. So while there are good practices that apply to all of those three, if you try to put yourself in the perspective of the receiver, there's the sources of distractions are quite different.
Stephanie, would you like to add anything else, especially given the fact that videos these days do serve a partial role of a talk as well? Would you like to make any addendums to your principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what Alberto said, putting our ideas in other people's brains is kind of the overall goal of, what all of these modalities are about. I think the video kind of holds a unique place in robotics in particular, because so much of what we do, I mean, Nick has this quote that, you know, the essence of robotic research is make the robot do something it couldn't do before and then explain why. And the video is sort of the thing that encapsulates that. So it's so often, you know, at the very beginning of a project, we will think about, and sorry, my son is a little excited. So the video is the thing that sort of encapsulates that. You know, this is the thing that you made the robot do that it couldn't do before. And we'll think about that at the beginning of a project. You know, what is that contribution going to actually look like? But I also agree, like, you know, that the presentation, you know, I tell my students, I consider preparing the presentation about your work a first class part of the research. Like, you know, when I have a piece of work that we've done and then I go and take it on the road and give a talk, I learned so much about the work that we did from the talk, from the process of preparing the talk, but also from the feedback and the discussions that we have with other people. You know, you understand it in new ways, and you know, it's a first class part of doing the research is making that talk and communicating it to other people.
Awesome, thanks. And I think following up on that question, maybe taking a slightly different avenue, this is more about the actual content of the talks and presentations. We had a question on the culture of flag planting and how it feels like it may be taking root in the robotics community, where people claim that they're first at something or that they're best at something. Is this a culture that you feel is a problem? Should it be something that we should try to address early on? Is it okay? We should let it flow? Do you think it's something even worth talking about?
I mean, I think, you know, research is about make the robot do something it hasn't done before. There's value in reproducing work, and maybe, you know, I feel like in robotics we have a challenge in reproducibility because our hardware stacks and software stacks are so different from each other's, that maybe even less than other fields we don't value that. Oh, I made my robot do what somebody else's robot already did. But I feel like always we've had this focus on being the first, you know, expanding what the robot could do.
Yeah, and I think it sometimes, because it is also analytical thinking in the sense of that we develop new models, and I think often we can actually also understand by just reading the paper why this approach is better than a previous one. So I understand the need for reproducibility, but on the other hand, it is also it would slow us down to a large extent if every paper that gets published needs to be checked as to whether the outcome is exactly that. I think that a good paper tells a story where you can actually understand from the paper what the outcome of the experiment is going to be, and why the robot is doing what it is doing. And I think this is the message that you should convey in a paper. This also understanding the foundations of robotics. I mean, we live in a time where we throw data at a network and then show that all of a sudden things are better than before. And all we can do now is look at the architectures and say, oh yes, this is a better architecture. If we are lucky, we can understand why this is a better architecture. But I think in these times, answering the why question has become much harder than before.
Yeah, maybe following on from your question, Nima, the perceived need to say, okay, we are the first ones to do these, or we are the first ones to do that, and sort of branding your contribution. I mean, I think that it is true to some degree that there are many degenerate behaviors that can come out of that need, the perceived need. On the other hand, I think that there are important also consequences of it, right? So being able to say we were the first ones that did this implies somehow that you've done the effort of understanding the related work, the related literature, right? So while it might sort of drive the community towards some unhealthy competition or unhealthy approach towards choosing problems, I think that there is value also in making sure that you understand the scope of where you're working and what has already been done. How to compare the benefits and the drawbacks from that is difficult, but I think that there are good consequences too from sort of forcing yourself to be able to articulate what is it that you think that is new or that no one has done before from your work.
I also think, you know, we're lucky in robotics that there's just so much to do. You know, it's really quite rare in our field, and that's not true in every field, but in our field, it's quite rare that, you know, somebody is doing the exact same thing that you're doing. And a lot of time the newness is not, you know, oh, I do X% better on this data set, but like I thought of a new problem. I thought of a way to make the robot do something cool that nobody else, it's like, you know, this unique point in a high dimensional space that's really underexplored. So we're lucky, I think, to be in a field where there's just so much opportunity. There's so many different things to do. There's so many things that have just never been tried. And, you know, it's really fun to be the first person to try something.
But isn't that also dangerous, right? That the fact that like we can do whatever we want. So maybe we are a science that doesn't have focus then.
Well, I think we're a new science. We're a young field, and I think that's one of the consequences of being a young field is we don't have. I know I was telling George actually that we should write like the now I forgot the guy's name, the mathematician dude who made the big list of 10 problems that everybody then worked on. What's his name? The mathematician in like around the turn of the century. We should have those problems in robotics.
Hamilton?
No. I can't believe I forgot his name. But we should make those problems. We should have that, like we don't, you know, in physics, they're thinking about the grand unified theory of physics, and that's like the big, they've all agreed, you know, like that's what it is. But in robotics, like, you know, maybe someday in robotics, we'll have this grand, like, you know, George and I talk about the grand unified model of robotics that's going to tie all the different pieces together. But we're a young field and we haven't converged on that yet. And I think we will, but I think we haven't yet. And I think that's one of the exciting things about being in a young field.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very interesting question, Wolfram, whether there is danger in the free for all and the absolute free form that we have for research in robotics. And I think that to some degree, it can be frustrating for the individual, right? So not understanding, okay, what are the problems where we have to make progress? How do I compare myself with everyone else? How do I know what has been done and what hasn't been done? Well, like if I can choose my problem and my solution and my application and any combination of those, like what kind of a mess of field this is. So I think that at the individual level, that can be frustrating. My question is whether really it is dangerous or whether it is bad as a community level, right? It is still possible that while at the individual level is frustrating, the community level, it's still perfectly fine and we're making progress. It's just we're not enjoying it at the individual level.
I mean, my son is a physics person, and I know that from his research, you know, he was working on the Higgs boson hunt as well, and so they worked for it for many years, and now that they finally proved that the Higgs boson exists, right, all of a sudden a large fraction of the community has nothing to do anymore, and they need to justify their existence. So,
Yes.
so having the one of these big goals is also a danger, right? Although it provides focus and for the community, and yeah, and on the other hand, they are more successful in getting really huge grants. You know, that is what also worries me, that we are not that good at that. Could be a reason that we are too diverse. I don't know.
I mean, I looked up. It's Hilbert, the Hilbert
Yeah,
problems.
Oh, Hilbert,
The
there you go.
mathematician, yeah, Hilbert. But I do think that there's, ways. I think we can look. Like, I had some friends that were in chemistry, which is a field where, like, people would be different labs would be working on the exact same problem, like the exact same hypothesis, and it was like a totally zero-sum situation where, like, one was going to win and one was going to not have a paper, and it had spent all this money and basically got scooped, and it's set up that way. And the culture that they had to deal with was really bad. Like, not only bad to be in, but I thought bad for science, to the point where they decided to leave the field. And I think there's an extreme of the competitive aspect that can happen that could be bad. I don't think we're there yet. I hope we never get there. And I think it's good to articulate that, we don't want that to happen to us. I think the other thing we have is industry. One thing that was happening in chemistry, it seemed, was that the industry options were really not as fun and satisfying and rewarding as the academic options. Whereas in robotics and in computer science more broadly, we sort of have this industry escape valve where, there's really wonderful positions and jobs and work that you can do in industry. So, if you get sick of the academic grind, or it's not working out for you, or I don't want to even say it like that. Like, there's just a lot more options. There's a lot more places to do wonderful work.
Are you trying to tell us something, Stephanie? Are you considering?
Well, I work at Real-Time Robotics 1 day a week.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I love it. It's super fun. Not only because it's a group of people that's, like, all organized towards really trying to make an impact on industrial robotics. But also I've learned a tremendous amount about industrial robotics, and, how there's such a huge disconnect between robots and factories and anything we're doing in the academic world, which seems strange and wrong. So it's been a tremendous learning opportunity for that reason.
So we have another question just to pull us back into the main topic of this panel. Let's see. So Wafer usually has this practice where you do a dirty laundry slide. So related to that, what are your opinions about and best practices about discussing limitations, which is not generally a norm in robotics venues? What do you feel about including dirty laundry in your paper or talk or video, and how would you sort of go about doing them?
I mean, from my perspective, if I may go ahead, it's usually done when you write about potential future work, and then you automatically like discuss like what are things that you would like to put on top of that, and there's also then a description of some of the limitations. I mean, I agree. You could dirty laundry is maybe a little bit more strong. It is. Maybe even more negative aspects. I would be fine with that, and think people should be self-critical as well. In particular, when the paper is published, then yeah, you can be as negative as you want about your paper. But yeah, I
think more than that, like when you write your paper, in my group, we try hard to not, to say like all the things that we did that might be questionable. Yeah. I think that's part of scientific honesty, that you do that. And you don't have to like put it right in front in the introduction, here's why you shouldn't read this paper. But like, in the paper, in the results, when we read about the video, or whatever we did, like if there was something we are wrong, wrong or questionable with the way we did the data collection or whatever, I tell my students it's okay. So, sometimes we think it's not okay and we won't send the paper, but if we think it's okay enough to send the paper, we still think you should write it in the paper, and we're making a judgment call that the thing that we did wrong or that was suboptimal is still okay, that it makes the work okay, but we also put it in the paper so that the reviewers and the reader can make that same call or not, they can make their own decision about it, is what I mean.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think it's very important, right? So educationally, so if you want to explain someone how you got your system to work, you have to explain which tricks you had to also use to actually make it work, and explain why that's okay, right? That there's still value in your contributions, and I think that applies all to papers and videos and talks, maybe even more to videos because of the need of them to be concise and sort of spill the beans fast. But we always fill in the gap, right? Whenever there's something that we don't explain, the reader will make up an explanation for it. And if you don't explain your story, the reader will make it up. And I think that we use, maybe unconsciously, we use that gap sometimes as a way to hide the things that we are less proud of.
Yeah, to put some self-reflection or dirty laundry in that conversation. Eh? So if we really optimize everything, then so the question is like are we ourselves like polishing things too much by doing so? And I mean, there was a time where people said scientific conferences should be like TED Talks, and that is interesting. I mean, with RSS, right, with these 3-minute published or polished presentations, which I really like, by the way, but that comes with the problem that it is extremely polished, and then on top of that, you could actually, like, if you go even further, basically say here is whatsoever, like, how do you implant your story into the reader's or the spectator's brain? And that is what you see in TED Talks is, for example, where people bring emotions into the presentation. And one of the strongest emotions that you can bring is when people die, when you report about a relative of you having died. And this is why in many TED Talks, you actually experience that people talk about someone's death. And imagine that we in our scientific conversations, just in order to optimize this right now, speak about people dying and things like that. I do not know as to whether that would actually be fun in the very end. And I think there are also limits. Yeah, I know that this happens in TED Talks. They teach this to you, right? Bring emotions into your presentation in order that it sticks, that people remember it. And I think there should be a fine line for science in order actually not to do this, but I do not know exactly where it is.
Yeah, great. And just to follow up on this question, it feels like we are forcing presentations to be shorter, papers to be shorter. If you've seen the history of like the length of papers, they seem to have been reducing in size. Should we be asking our organizers, the people who are in charge, to actually go back to longer form platforms, or is this reduction in size okay, a good thing? Because then with this reduction in size, you don't have the space to go into these details that you're talking about here.
I mean, I generally find the shorter, I mean, there's a limit to it, but I feel like RSS actually, made a change to be longer because they said the references don't count in the page limit, which effectively gives you like a whole extra page of content. And I felt like the cutting that we were doing before that reference change happened was often making the paper better. It was taking out, deadwood that was, not important to, how the paperwork details you didn't really need to spend time on. Whereas now, it's there's just this less time pressure, if you will. I think that there's a top end to that. You know, I certainly don't think you can RSS papers should be 1 page long or just abstracts or something. There's some fields do that, you know, chemistry or astronomy. My friend's an astronomer, and they have conference abstracts, and it's literally an abstract, and you give the talk, and then you have the journal paper, which is, you know, as long as one of our journal papers. The other thing is we have journal papers, right? Like we have forms where you really do give the full detailed, you know, with every single detail that you can think of when you have that opportunity.
Yeah,
So,
when you're
sorry, I see we're getting speakers from our next panel session. So maybe this is a good time to wrap up this session. I want to thank Wolfram, Alberto, and Stephanie for joining us in this session. Please stick around for the next one to ask questions. This was a really good conversation, and we can get started with the next panel.
Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do have all the next panelists here, I think.
Yeah, Henny also dropped by. Actually disappeared.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Hello.
Hey, so let's go around, introduce. Let's go around and have the speakers introduce themselves a little bit, and then maybe give 1 or 2 minutes to talk about, you know, your talk and give some summary, maybe some key takeaways, and then we can go ahead and get started with some questions. Chad, why don't you get us started?
Oh, great. Thanks, Mustafa. Thanks, Nima, for organizing this workshop. I think good citizenship in robotics is something that that should be a foremost priority, and so I appreciate it. So I'm Chad Jenkins. I'm faculty in computer science at the University of Michigan. I am also, along with my co-panelist Ella Adkins, I'm an associate director of the Michigan Robotics Institute. And so the talk that I gave was on my research in general is on robot programming by demonstration. We do a lot in terms of having robots be able to see the world and then be able to learn from people and what they're doing, so that we can try to achieve their goals. And so my talk was really about it was an apology to Robert Williams, who earlier this year was falsely arrested by American law enforcement, or I say the Farmington Hills Police Department, or Detroit Police, because he was misrecognized on facial recognition system, and I think given the prevalence of deep learning across our field, robotics, computer vision, AI, machine learning, I think there are some lessons that we can learn in terms of how we can do better, and I think similar to some of my other panelists, I think part of the problem is how we use the technology, but also the people that are allowed to be involved in its development. And I think that's something that, as good citizens, we can do a lot to improve.
Ella?
Hey, I'm Ella Adkins. I work with Chad at the University of Michigan Robotics Institute. Chad's great. And I also am a professor of aerospace engineering. So I think about things that fly more often than things that work in a mere 2 dimensions. And I don't say that as an insult, just I like the 3rd dimension. So the presentation that I gave was really questioning how we can have diversity in thought. So this has so many dimensions. I stared at a blank PowerPoint for a long time saying, what should I actually put here? And I ended up with some very general pictures at the beginning talking about science coming as a precursor to calculus and chemistry and lipo and AI with semantic versus deep networks and law. And from my own personal perspective, I've agonized over the fact that the FAA has all these stringent safety certification requirements that have been passed down even to the little drones that we can hold in our hands, where self-driving cars can come out and crash into barriers at 80 some miles an hour and they don't have any sort of oversight other than the liability concerns that a manufacturer faces. So that kind of has drawn me into this world of looking at diversity of thought in all aspects of what affects us as roboticists, ranging from science, math, and computer science to law and policy that we have to go through. So then I asked two big questions. The first one is, you know, it seems like when we put something that we're really excited about because it's novel, truly novel and innovative in through a system, whether it's a proposal or a paper, you get all these reviewer comments and they end up rejecting the paper because they're not excited about the new stuff. They want extensions on the familiar. So then I had a maybe longer than I should have, because the goal was 15 minutes and I think my presentation was 28 minutes, discussion of how do we actually figure out how to crack this nut, how to celebrate new problems, new approaches, new applications, as opposed to just making incremental changes. Now, both are valuable to be published and worked on as research, but it's important that we have this diversity of thought and that we celebrate it, as opposed to saying, hey, it's not as connected to the literature as we might like. The other part of my presentation was looking at schemas and bias. So I shamelessly borrowed some of the University of Michigan's advanced program slides that cover some of the definitions of schemas and bias, and went through a little bit of how all of us have unconscious bias, and we tend towards schemas, which are really rushing to decisions based on things like appearance because we don't have time. We can't afford all of that look into the detail of what a person might have as their true characteristics, as opposed to what they seem at a very surface level. And ended the discussion with continue to be original, work on not having unconscious bias, etc.
And finally, Henny.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Henny Edmoni. I'm an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon. Thank you, Mustafa and Nima, for the invitation. I am totally fangirling about being on a panel with Ella Adkins and Chad Jenkins, so this is awesome. I study human-robot interaction. My goal is to develop robots that understand people. I'm so sorry. Steffi Telix had her child screaming. I have my two cats fighting in the corner, so we're all keeping it real. So the goal of our work is to understand people so that robots can help them better. And that means understanding human intent, understanding how nonverbal behaviors correlate to people's mental states so that we can design robots that are responsive to what people actually need at a particular time. My talk, though, is not about my research. It's about diversity and inclusion in robotics. It has pieces that overlap really nicely with Chad's talk and with Ella's talk. And if you're watching this recorded, I highly recommend going and watching all three talks. My goal was to give a little primer on what diversity means and why it's important. I make the argument that diversity is good for research. We are lucky enough as researchers to be in a field where innovation is king, or queen, where we benefit when we're creative, as Ella said, when we're novel, when we push the boundaries of what we know. And we've seen that diverse teams have more innovation. Research shows that more diversity leads to more problems being discovered and more solutions being discovered. And because of that, we want to increase diversity, but it's really hard. And I outlined a couple of reasons why it's hard, including implicit bias, which I already mentioned, and give just a few kind of random tips that I've picked up on how to improve diversity and inclusion in the communities that I'm a part of. So you can see the end of the presentation has small actions that you can do by yourself and big actions that you need other people to do to help increase the diversity of the groups that you're part of.
All right, thank you so much. So let's treat this more as a discussion. So I'll get you guys started by injecting the first question. So given the consequences of deploying technologies like face recognition that contain biases and weren't ready to be deployed, are there such problems and applications in robotics and AI that you'd like to highlight that deserve care and attention right now so that we can avoid such premature deployment?
So I would like to say that I don't see a distinction between what happens in computer vision and machine learning and robotics and AI in general. We're all, if you go back to the early history of AI, to Shaky from SRI, it's all about, about how do we get things to move in the real world and behave in a quote unquote intelligent manner. And so it's only because the problem was so hard that we fractured off into these different communities. But I think the issues of decision making in general, in an automated fashion, I think is, I think we have to calibrate our expectations. We like to get into hype cycles across all of these areas about our work is so great, and look, we pushed it up to 99%, and isn't that amazing? But I think the reality is when something gets out into the world, 99% isn't good enough. I would never get on a plane that gave me a 99% chance of getting to my destination safely. And so if you're talking about let's say a planning system that's using a neural network based heuristic, or you're talking about like not just a face recognition system, but let's say a scene estimation system, an object estimation system, emotion recognition. If you're talking about, even force control, like do you trust that neural network force controller? Well, let's hope we collected enough data, and let's hope that we had the right people in the room to think about the type of data that we should be collecting, such that it made good decisions. And so I know there's a lot of people thinking about the use of these technologies, but I think it has more to do with the people in the room as we're doing the research and as we're doing the development.
So I want to mention a couple things to follow on to that. So a bit of trivia. Did you know that the space shuttle was only predicted to be 97% reliable? And it was. The remarkable thing is, if you look at the statistics, they got the percent right when we saw the number of crashes that were accidents that we had over the years. But that was a situation where astronauts accept risk. One of the reasons that they choose to do it is because the benefit of going into space is worth the risk of getting there and coming back safely. One of the things I had in my presentation that I didn't talk about yet is teaching scientific laws by name. And maybe this is like my great innovation in the presentation that I gave, but if you look at things like the Wikipedia page on the list of scientific laws named after people, you'll find zero diversity there. Just about everything listed is a European white male name. And that's not terrible, because that's part of the history of where the current scientific principles that we have were developed. But I do think it has unconscious bias ramifications if we show the pictures of these people and make that a part of our lesson without an equivalent discussion of, in the future, it won't necessarily be like that. And I can tell you, in all of my years of sitting through a whole bunch of lectures, I have never had a faculty that followed up a presentation of the history of science with the fact that that was the past and the times were different, as opposed to that being the way the future will look as well. The second thing I wanted to say is, at Michigan.
Actually, Ella, can I jump in? Can I jump in on that and ask a question? Just a thought exercise for everybody. Does anybody know who Rosalind Franklin is? Because you're talking about Wikipedia and you're talking about, who we laud in sort of history. And so if you don't know, you should look her up. And also, I think, when you're mentioning Wikipedia as well, you can look up the Wikipedia history on Donna Strickland's page as well. And I think that's something we have to think about. So I just want to interject with that. I'll let you go to your second.
And I mean, it's interesting. I didn't put this on my slide because where do you go, right? The Henry Ford Museum has a whole wall of mathematicians. And one of my friends, who's a high school teacher, had pestered them for years because there were no women on their wall. So their solution was actually to put a little brochure with 8.5 by 11 sheet pamphlets of the women, but they still don't have any on their main wall. So that's an issue. And it's not like there were never any famous mathematicians. It's just that they chose not to put them there.
I interrupted. You were going to make a second point.
My final point, I think, was, and maybe this is a slam on Michigan, but I want to bring it up. There was a fascinating meeting that I went to a few years ago when our Robotics Institute was first being formed, where there was going to be a push on autonomous vehicles, and I was outvoted. It was decided in this meeting that autonomous vehicles would not include anything that operated in 3 dimensions, that they would be limited to 2 dimensions. And to me, that seemed so ridiculous, right? Because I'm like, you just cut out underwater, space, and air from what you're calling autonomous vehicles. And I get that it's Michigan, that there are the auto industries all around, and that there's tons of money flowing in to do auto research, but that really branded, I think, the Robotics Institute for a while in a way that was unfortunate and made some people, including myself, feel like we weren't really part of it. And the robotics community has a little bit of that as well. And so as good citizens, part of the inclusion is to recognize that even if it doesn't look like a robot, when you see a picture of it in the first page of the paper, it might be a robot or it might have relevance to robotics anyhow. So be better, and I think we're getting there.
I have many things to say. Oh, sorry, Nima.
Sorry, I was just going to say if Henny would like to jump in.
Yeah.
These are great points. I get asked what a robot is all the time, Ella, and I have my standard definition, as I'm sure every roboticist does. But I agree. I think the notion of robots is expanding. I wanted to think a little bit about why we have this gap between systems like aerospace that are very well regulated and very careful and very safe, and AI for incarceration, right, which is extremely unregulated and extremely problematic. And I think Chad said it's the hype machine, and I think the hype machine is right. We as researchers are putting out products that are not ready for prime time, and that's kind of our job. Like, our job as academics is to be thinking about these really difficult questions that are going to matter as products in 20 years. I think the development cycle has gotten so short that the work that we're doing is being put into practice without due care. And so I guess one question I have to my fellow panelists is, like, where is that responsibility? I think the responsibility lies a lot with the researchers to think about the implications of their work. And I think it also lies with the people who are putting these, who are making products out of these, who are selling them to police departments, for example. So what is your feeling on the kind of chain of responsibility there? I just took over moderating the panel. I have no answers, only questions.
I'm waiting to see who should jump in, but I will boldly jump in first and say, from the perspective of what I've studied in the aviation to automotive realm, I am convinced that there is somewhere in the middle that needs to actually happen. The sad truth, as we've seen in the 737 MAX cases, is that the FAA does not know how to safety certify software. There are policies there, but they involve reams of paper with spreadsheets and pointers to other things. And the people who read those papers usually aren't even experts with writing or debugging software. So that's not really a working process. There's a double challenge where the regulators recognize, and rightly so, that they shouldn't just give up and say, okay, you guys self-regulate, because that will result in the same kind of problems that we see now with the surveillance systems and the like. But they also aren't open-minded about seeing new processes. How do we allow adaptive systems to make things safer? We all know that we have to leave several people in the loop to recover if a vehicle has a problem, if the only things that we're going to deploy in that vehicle are deterministic rules and the like, all the way down to the controller. Yet we don't know how to certify the adaptation. So that's a challenge. Flip side of that, of course, is that those who would deploy products fast to make a buck don't really want that kind of oversight. And nor should they, because if you don't have to have it, then keep going. But I guess where I'm struggling is in trying to understand whether the liability check and balance system is sufficient in the 21st century. And I think it's not, because the laws are not updated and they're not consistent.
If I could sort of go off of both of those points, I think one of the things that is sort of a killer to good citizenship in our field is Google Scholar, because oftentimes what we're trying to do, getting to this quick development cycle, I want to get things out, is we're so busy trying to get entries on our Google Scholar page that, that we're going for the least publishable unit. It gets to a lot of the incentive that you talked about in your talk, Ella, that the incrementality that's coming into our field is really because we're trying to, it's like, how do we get that next publication out, right? That is, the responsibility that we have, that we maybe should be thinking about, Henny, is sort of, it goes in the wash because we're incentivized to push out papers quickly. And so that doesn't really leave a lot of time for you to think about, well, what's the larger implication of my work? And maybe, maybe there's broader dimensions I should think about. I think in the previous panel, they were mentioning, they were saying, do we go with the conference style model that we have right here, where we can, shrink everything down into an easily digestible unit, or do we try the journal model, right? The conference is just, we just put an idea out there, and then we elaborate it in an end-page long journal paper and try to explore the depths of it. And I think that publishing model does affect the citizenship and the intellectual output of our field. So I'll stop right there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually like a perfect point, and it also leads really nicely into a question we had about top-down incentives, whether these top-down incentives are for publishing and getting funding, which is going into like the Google Scholar realm, or even promoting inclusivity and diversity. So the question specifically asks, so in the industry, several steps have been taken into improving diversity through hiring and full-time employment through fellowship programs that support students and underrepresented groups. What do you think along this axis is the interplay between academia and industry, and how can we have a better, well-fostered sort of top-down approach to promoting diversity or promoting good scholarship even?
Well, Chad, you're going to laugh when you hear what I have to say right now. Industry is discouraging diversity right now at universities because they are taking many of the top talent and offering them money that is so difficult to turn down. And in return, even though these faculty are well funded, they don't have time to mentor their students in many cases. So we're out there recruiting as hard as we can a diverse student population. And these students, maybe naively, when they get to a university, expect one-on-one contact with their advisors, maybe even weekly, maybe multiple times a week if you include group meetings. And this shouldn't be a ridiculous expectation, because a PhD student is an advanced researcher who has already completed a lot of material and proven themselves capable of doing original research. Yet the industry right now is saying, hey, why don't you leave campus for a couple of years? Go out and try things. Well, what happens to the students they leave behind? They don't get that one-on-one mentorship, and that's a challenge. So better would be for companies to maybe do a little more to be less greedy, to separate the work that they need to keep proprietary inside their corporate shelters, whether you're living at home behind a firewall doing the work, or whether you're actually in residence at the company after coronavirus has subsided, and instead say, we celebrate collaboration through proper research channels. We're going to fund your students through the university. It can be open research. That way, the advisor and the student who needs mentorship, who deserves mentorship, can have a reason, more incentive to work together. I don't know about the salaries, right? I'm to the age where I care about retirement, and it's hard, right? If you can get $500,000 a year by going to industry when your salary in academia is not ever going to get that high, it's hard to turn down those opportunities. But it really is a challenge, and the professors that are left behind have to carry a lot of the burden that the people who go into industry leave for them. There you go. I'm not afraid to say controversial things.
Well, let me add to that and say that I think right now we have a crisis in our academic landscape because of what you're saying. The enrollments that we have in a computer science program right now, which a lot of times is driven by artificial intelligence and robotics, we can't service the demand for our undergraduate students. And so this is leading to sort of, I think a lot of minority students would say sort of a Hunger Games style academic climate in our undergraduate programs. And that's all fueled by, by the six-figure salary that you can get from a company once you complete your undergraduate program. Those are students that wouldn't go to graduate school and aren't going to graduate school and so forth. And so I think we need some recalibration. Sometimes, there's it's good enough to get a CS minor and be a nuclear engineering major or a sociology major. Because I think, computing is sort of a foundation that we use in robotics as well. But I think we need sort of a recalibration of how we're thinking about the academic enterprise, the academy as a whole, in order to, and recalibrating to help our people and our colleagues in industry understand that they have a big impact on us through the incentive that they create.
I have so many thoughts about the academic enterprise, but I will make one point about incentives. So there are some incentives that are in place that I think are good. For example, the National Science Foundation has this broadening participation in computing plan that you need to submit when you submit some of your grants that shows a meaningful commitment to increasing diversity in using the work that you do. That's useful. I think awards like the Test of Time Awards, right? Like the RSS Test of Time Awards, recognition that looks back 10 years at long-term impact is also useful because it keeps us from just incentivizing these, thinnest salami slice research papers. So I think that there are ways of doing this. I think but the reality is we need more. One thing I think we desperately need that we don't talk a lot about is computing knowledge outside of the field of computing. So we need our politicians and people making laws to understand how computers work. We need people who are CEOs in companies who aren't necessarily technical to have a basic understanding of how privacy works, for example, and how security works and how computers work. So I would love if, every sociology major had a minor in computing, Chad, because I think that they would be able to carry the work that we do forward and make an impact in every field. I think it's all a dynamical system, right? And if we turn a lever in one place, it's going to have a huge impact everywhere.
Right, and I also wanted to say, because you talked about National Science Foundation and broadening participation plans, I think that is one step in the right direction. We could do even more to incentivize good behavior and diversity, good citizenship in our field. Because Mustafa, I believe you work at FAIR, right? My entry into research was through Jessica Hodgins, right? In 1997, I showed up at her doorstep and I was like, I want to do research. I don't know what I'm doing, and I worry that a lot of people would have said, I'm not taking a chance on me, but she did, and that was, I think, partially through the legislation and all of the things that happened in the 1970s, 1960s, and 70s to encourage to have women be a part of higher education, have a much greater role, and I think that laid the foundation for greater diversity across the board in our field, and I think we can take an even further next step. And so I could go off on that, but I would like to hear what our other panelists have to say.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the computing and other majors thing. I am a professor of aerospace engineering, even though I'm in the Robotics Institute. It's an institute, not a department. And my PhD was in computer science. So I thought that this would be possible. And I'll tell you, after 21 years of trying to do it, that it's much harder than it would seem. If you try to bring these courses into the native departments, the first thing you hear is, well, that's great. We're going to support you. Good luck. And then the second thing you hear is, you're going to take this required course off the books over my dead body. So it's never been a problem to introduce new material. New professors are encouraged to do that. And nobody particularly cares what that new material is, as long as you're helping teach required courses every so often. But what they don't want is for you to come in and say that your new material is more important than legacy material. So I'm back to my theme of legacy, but that is actually a really hard question. If we're going to have increased understanding of data and privacy and programming and whatever else you want in computer science, some of the physics and chemistry at all is going to have to go away from a normal major because we don't get to just add credits.
Well, seems like we're pretty much out of time, but if the panelists are okay continuing the discussion, we can have maybe another final question to round out the discussion. Does that sound good? All right. So you guys touched on this a little bit, maybe in your talks, but also in the conversation right now. And so this question is really pertinent to that. So law and legislation typically catches up after a new technology. How can we be more proactive in the technology we're developing? So NeurIPS this year required authors to have a broader impact research statement. Is this a step in the right direction? What else or what more can we do in the robotics community?
I would first take the broader impacts. When I look at NSF proposals, the broader impacts usually are just sort of a spaghetti on the wall. Here's all the things we were thinking of, and it's unfocused. And I think we're all trying to figure out what that means. And so, I'm not as much of a fan of the broader impacts. But I think this is where if we're as a good citizenship, as a good scientist, and I don't know how to bring this about, but a good scientist is going to think about what is all the different dimensions of their work, right? I love the movie Real Genius from 1984, which I think gets to some of these things. I really like listening to the words of the discussions between Oppenheimer and Teller when they're thinking about how to develop nuclear technology, and I think it's a good discussion to have. And as scientists, we should have that discussion. It shouldn't be sort of regulated or legislated. It should just be part of our culture, part of our ethos. How to do that, I'm less sure, but I know that that's how I feel about it.
So I want to add, I think one of the things we're doing right at Michigan is introducing courses like an ethics for robotics course that Ben Kuipers and I have introduced that covers a lot of the safety and privacy issues and how they connect both to the technology and law sides of things. So maybe those types of experiences should be more pervasive across the robotics community to make sure everybody sees that side as well as the technology while they're still in school. And I think we have to reconcile the process by which we lobby. I've spent a sad amount of time in Washington, and it's both depressing and exciting at the same time. The universities have organized to have quite a lot of authority as a group. And so if you actually want to get a message in front of the senators and the other, and all of the members of Congress, the first step is to meet with whoever your university representative or lobbyist is in Washington and make sure that what your expertise is and how it connects to legal matters is on their radar screen, so that they'll begin to send you those emails and say, hey, there's this bill coming up before Congress, what do you think? And then they know staffers who are the people that do a lot of the work, and that can manage to get the attention of some of the Congress people. And if you're persistent about that, it's not like tomorrow you're going to get exactly what you want, but over a period of maybe 5 or 10 years, you can begin to see some of your ideas make their way into at least your own elected representatives groups, so that you can make a difference, even though you personally are not spending a lot of time walking the halls of the Senate and Congress chambers.
I think that's totally right. And I think universities do have a great lobby power as a unit, and we need to get better at using that. We also, at Carnegie Mellon we've taken a slightly different tack on the ethics, which is instead of a single independent course for students, we are trying to integrate it into all of the courses in a small way that's topically relevant. So Eleanor Rush and I led this charge in the Robotics Institute, which is a department at Carnegie Mellon, to try to get people thinking about the societal impact of their work. But I wanted to say there needs to be a culture shift, and I have no idea how to make culture shifts happen. But I think that things like the impact statement and the broadening participation statement for NSF are useful mechanisms for forcing people to articulate and to at least think a little bit about the impact of their work. But I think we need, as a community, to shift the culture so that people see the value in that they understand the value in thinking about their work more broadly, that no one ever says, well, this is the lawmaker's problem. This is the end user's problem. It's not my algorithm, right? It's just the data set it was trained on, right? We need to make that kind of thinking less attractive by shifting the culture. And I think part of that means educating our students in sociology and in law and in psychology, and these sort of soft fields that we've tried to avoid and ignore because they do have an impact on the way that our technology gets carried forward.
Yeah, and I would go farther and say maybe we should have better diversity in backgrounds in our students. So maybe we actually attract in robotics some psychologists and sociologists, et cetera, undergrads who can become part of our teams.
I would say that there's a line that I use where I say, if somebody asks what's the best major if somebody wants to go in robotics, and I'd say it's a quadruple major in CS, math, electrical, and mechanical with a minor in psychology. So I don't know how to.
It sounds like it would take a while.
Yeah, it would. It would. It takes a lot of us a long time to learn how to be roboticists and cover this entire space. So.
I'm glad you said that. Like, I don't have a training in robotics, right? I'm a computer scientist. And so all of the mechanical and electrical engineering I'm learning on the job. Right. And my students are getting trained in it. So they're teaching me, which is great. But right. I think that's an important point to make, that actually you don't have to have that quadruple major because you will eventually pick it up.
Right.
But you do need to eventually touch all those fields. Can we also encourage people to vote, especially if you're based in the US, which is what's most important to me, but in any election that you're in? What Ella was saying about lawmakers having our interests at heart and having our perspectives only happens if you vote at national and local elections.
Okay, those are some really good thoughts to end on. We want to thank all our panelists again, Chad, Henny, Ella. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the great conversation. And I guess we'll see all of you who are tuned in. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you in the next panel session in a few hours later today.
Thank you. Thank you, Nima.